Yeah, you're
Hi.
brilliant. Hello, this is Susie Walker here from Psychologies magazine. Hello, Susie Walker here. I'm just seeing lots of people joining us. It's Susie Walker, editor-in-chief at Psychologies magazine, and I am joined today by the wonderful Sarah Bonner, who is an organisational psychologist and coach, who is going to be talking to us about how to lead a virtual team. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Susie. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's really lovely to see you and have you here today. I've just been talking to Sarah before the interview, and I've already got a big list of things I'm going to do differently as a leader. I think, Sarah, I think what's happening at the moment is we're just coming out of COVID. A lot of people are learning how to work from home, and a lot of leaders and managers are maybe struggling a little bit about how to emotionally cope with being a kind of a virtual leader, and how do we do that? How do we navigate that? But I suppose my first question to you is where do we start? How do we set this up in the right way?
I think the way to start with virtual leadership, and it is a very difficult time for leaders, I think it's an unprecedented time, but I think the way to start is to really think about communication, like how are you communicating with your team? And I think that starts with a process of recontracting with your team from the outset. Recontracting. And I think that's a process of speaking to your team on an individual basis and collectively and asking them, what do you want from me? How do you want our interactions to go? So you have really clear parameters and expectations of yourself and of each other. And I think that's the simplest way. Ask people, what do they want? And I think then you'll have an understanding of what it is that they need and how you can interact with them.
Can you give me an example of what that might look like? So if I sort of said to myself, "Oh, we're going to recontract," I don't know what how does that work? Do I write it down, or what are the parameters for that? How do I do it?
I think initially, it's just a really simple conversation. And I think it's all wrapped up in, I'm just interested to know where you're at the moment, what's going on for you. Giving yourself some contextual awareness about what it is, what it's like for them working from home, and what do they need in that space. And I think just asking them. So again, like I said, where are you at? What's going on? How would you like to work? How would you like to have contact with me? How would you like to have contact with the rest of the team? So I think it's just about just understanding their parameters and kind of setting some kind of boundaries as well around what's going to be effective for them.
So we start with the individual, is it kind of individual conversations, and so at Psychologies we've been working kind of virtually for about 3 years now, so which has been great. But it's also then I think there's the joint the team discussion, isn't it, about how to work well as a team. So we had lots of discussions early days about, because sometimes I'm working crazy hours in the night time. And I will send off an email, and it's and because I'm the editor, I don't expect them to reply in the middle of the night. But
exactly.
Kind of people going blotchy saying, "Oh well, you emailed me at 3 o'clock in the morning," and I'm like, "Well, that's fine. It's just setting those parameters and boundaries in place, isn't it?"
Absolutely, it's really important. I think we need to understand that there's a level of flexibility that comes with working from home, virtual working. But I think we just need to respect each other's personal values and personal boundaries as well. So, for example, if you think it's okay, and you might be fine to send an email over the weekend, but somebody else might not, and that might feel like a real encroachment on their time and their space. So it's about helping people manage their boundaries and what's acceptable and the parameters with which they'd like to work. I was talking to somebody yesterday about they would really be fine with someone saying, okay, I'd like to do my working hours to be 6 a.m. till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. That works for me. So it's about having that level of flexibility and having that conversation with people about what works for you now. The rules have changed. The 9 till 5 is not something that we need to adhere to anymore. And I think that kind of goes back to, when we're at school, it's kind of a very Victorian way of working. And some people are morning people, some people are night owls, some people work better after a big gap in the afternoon. So I think we just need to understand how's the best way to help your team to be productive.
And I think that's the thing. I mean, because we work on a magazine, for example, it's very clear whether, you know, something hasn't been done or something. We're like, I always think of the magazine like an engine. We've got production, we've got design, we've got the editorial, and it all comes together and we will work together. We can see immediately when one of the cogs is a little bit out of sync or something. It's very easy for us to run a magazine virtually, but for maybe companies who it's a kind of a longer term project, or how do you measure productivity? How do you set the parameters for productivity versus just activity?
Yeah, so activity versus productivity are two really different things, aren't they? So activity, and we all know people, potentially you've worked in offices where people are just very active, they're busy moving around and doing stuff and telling people how active and productive they're being, but it's about the output and it's the quality of the output. So I think that's about setting very clear expectations of your team and then looking at the deliverables. What does this deliverable look like? So if you're asking someone to be productive and that day productivity might be about doing some research, what does that look like? What do you expect to see at the end of it? So it's being very clear about the expectations and agreeing those expectations up front so everybody knows what they're working towards. Otherwise, people are kind of left kind of flailing around, not really understanding what's expected of them. And that's disconcerting and that can create anxiety and stress. So
yeah. So be getting really clear about the expectations. What about the whole thing about motivation? So when you're working with a team, is it our job? Is it the job of the leader to motivate?
I think it's a big responsibility of a leader. I think at the end of the day, you are managing a team of people, and in order for them to be productive, they have to be kind of motivated. There's a theory about happy, productive worker theory. So people who are more happy and who have better supervision are likely to be more productive in their roles. So I think a part of motivation is, you have to think about what motivates people. And I think then that's when the individual relationships come in, understanding what motivates the people, what they're driven by, what they value is very much going to be the key to motivating them. So if someone is motivated by recognition, some kind of public demonstration of the work they've done or some public acknowledgement of their works, they have visibility, that's really going to motivate them to carry on and work in that way. Whereas somebody else might be very much motivated by having responsibility for a project and seeing it from start to finish with your support, that's going to keep them motivated. Whereas other people might be motivated by being kind and being treated with respect and being considerate, and maybe the person that likes to just maybe get a little note at the end of the day saying, well done, I see you and I really appreciate all your hard work. So this is really about those interpersonal relationships, understanding each and every member of your team, which is a different skill for leaders. I think in an office, face to face, you need that to an extent, but now it's even more critical that you dig deep, that you're curious, and that you really try and listen to what's not being said from your team of people. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, and that kind of open communication we were talking about earlier, that offices can be this kind of hotbed of passive aggressive piece, and then we want to talk about the kind of thing about vulnerability. So now we're working from home, often we're seeing much more of the whole person, and you know, how do we bring, you know, that level of vulnerability to work? I mean, the fear is that will be used, you know, I'm a single mother and I always say I'll never play that card, but sometimes it's difficult, you know. I'm trying to lead the magazine and I'm being a parent and I'm trying to kind of have the face of somebody who is I've got it all going on, but behind the scenes it can be a bit chaotic.
It's really hard.
So but it's, you know, probably you may see more of the chaos with it in a virtual sense, because you're seeing my background and my home and my son coming up in the middle of a Zoom meeting or whatever it is, saying, can he have £2.50 to go on the tube or whatever it is. So my question to you is, how do we manage that vulnerability, and how do we kind of create environments for our team that they can show up and be real, to really honestly communicate about how they're dealing with things?
I think you can create these environments by encouraging people to be open and acknowledging. I think, and again, like I said before, it's about that contextual awareness. And I think by asking them to be open to share and kind of creating psychological safety, I think that's your role as a leader. You've got to create that psychological safety for people to be able to feel that they can be vulnerable, they can be open, they can come to you in a very honest way without that fear or judgment. And I think that's, and everybody fears judgment. And I think we've gone from a time where we used to kind of get on the train, go to the office or drive to the office or whatever it was, and there was distance between your home life and your work life. And now we feel like it's slightly melting into one. And it's quite intrusive. It's kind of, for me, there's like a level of intimacy, inviting people into your home. It's, although they're not physically there, they're there. They can see your personal surroundings, and that sense of separation has suddenly become slightly kind of distant. You know, you don't have that separation anymore. So I think it's about encouraging open conversation, encouraging dialogue. I think it's about you showing your vulnerabilities. I think sometimes we don't need people to be saying that they've been perfect every day and that they've been really productive every day. I think it's just about being honest about what you've achieved, about your capabilities, and just asking people, just doing a temperature check, really being curious and asking people, how are you doing? No, honestly, how are you doing? And listening to what they're saying. Look out for those nonverbal cues as well. If their tone of voice is slightly different from one conversation to the next, you know that there's something wrong there. So you've got to really tune in to your team. And that starts with having those conversations at the beginning and getting to know them on a slightly more informal level.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right in terms of the kind of open communications, really listening and really hearing people. What about conflict? So it feels like conflict in a virtual team can fester, and it can what's the word, get bigger.
Yeah, it can kind of be elevated really quickly and it grows.
The word for that, but I can't think what the word is. But yes, and so what's the best way of dealing with conflict in a virtual team, or when you're working with a team and you're maybe irritated that someone hasn't done that, or there's stuff going on over here, and you don't want, because as soon as you put the Zoom call finished, you know, it sits there and it's like,
yeah, it does.
All of that. Oh. So how do we deal with that?
I think conflict is very much about understanding, recognizing what's triggered the person. I think, and if you don't understand what's triggered the person, it's really hard to resolve the issue itself. Generally, a conflict, in my experience, is not about the thing that's actually happened. It's about something else that has been left unresolved. So again, it's about creating a safe space for the parties who are in conflict to discuss what it is that's happened, so they feel heard. And I think that's the thing about conflict. Conflict resolution is not demonstrated well generally. I think we have a culture within the UK of just sweeping things under the carpet and let's not talk about it. And the more carpets it's over the top, where hopefully that thing doesn't get out eventually and tell us that it's a problem. So I think it's about addressing issues and your leader encouraging an open environment. But hopefully, if you understand your team well enough, you'll possibly be able to spot when you see those things coming up. You'll see when someone's triggered, and you might be able to challenge them or challenge a person that's done it, or you might be able to go to the person maybe after the incident and say, I noticed that's the second time that's happened. I've noticed you react in that way. So help me understand what's going on. What can I do to help? What can I help you do? How can I support you in this conversation with this person? Because I would always encourage the people that are in conflict to speak directly to each other. You should sit in on that. But I think it's about encouraging those people to kind of air their grievance in a constructive way, not you did this, you did this. I think it's about saying, so this is what happened. This is how I felt at the time. This is how I would have liked for that to have played out for me. Is that something that you can consider?
Sure, a great languaging again. And sometimes I feel often we don't know the right language. So help me understand is a great phrase. I love that.
Yeah.
Also around the conflict piece, it's I like about taking responsibility for your own triggers. So knowing when you're triggered, and sort of noticing that, and maybe, so what work can we do? So for example, if I'm triggered in a meeting, I know that often it's when someone's trying to take control. I'm like, oh, don't try and control me. Oh! And I freak out. From childhood, etc., but it's in the moment. So you're triggered. You think, oh my God, I'm so triggered right now, and you don't make it worse. What can we do? What's the best way to handle that when you're triggered and you don't want to just
you don't want to fly off the handle? Because I think that's our first response, especially when we're triggered. I think what we do, we tend to go into kind of threat mode, and when we're in threat mode, we just don't think clearly. We call upon behavioral responses that we've used in the past that have kept us safe, and they aren't always helpful to us, because we have system 1, system 2 thinking, and then suddenly our brain kicks in and goes, don't worry, don't even think about this, I've got this. So what you need to do in those moments is just take a beat, just take a second and recognize your own triggers, recognize your own responses. I know my responses are, I'm getting a bit hot and prickly and my heart is beating faster and I can hear it so loudly and I want to say something and my skin goes all tingly. As soon as I recognize all those things, I think, okay, I'm triggered. I know I'm triggered. I need to take a beat. I need to take a beat. I need to understand. I need to process what's actually happened here. Am I under threat? Am I in danger? Possibly not. How is the best way for me to respond in this situation? Do I need to say something now? Do I need to excuse myself? Do I need to challenge the other person? So it's about really understanding what behavioral response is going to be the most helpful for me in that moment, whilst taking the heat out of my response, which is it's a tough thing to do.
That's a great phrase. Again, a great phrase. Taking the heat. I think you said earlier around curiosity is like about your own. And you can't control yourself in the moment. Just for me, just say nothing. Just it and think, okay, I'll process that later. But rather than make it the situation worse, rather than escalate, that was the word I was trying to come up with. Escalate the situation.
We escalate, and I think we escalate sometimes in a moment where we're not using our rational brain. And I think that's when it becomes really hard. And that's when you kind of say and do things that you possibly can't really filter or take back. And sometimes there's a lot of truth in that, but there's a way to kind of package up that truth so that it's delivered in a constructive way that gets you to where you want to be. And I think also when you're triggered in that moment, you have to think about what is it that I ultimately want to achieve in this situation? Do I want to achieve a situation where everybody's angry, or do I want to achieve a situation where I want people to understand how I've been made to feel and how I don't want them to treat me going forward? So I think you need to really be present about what is it that I want to achieve? What is the ultimate outcome here? What am I to gain by responding in a particular way?
Yeah. But again, I think there's a level of emotional intelligence to that, isn't there?
Yeah.
And I've been doing self-development for years, maybe 30 years, and I still struggle. So, I mean, it's having a compassion for yourself as well. But, at the very least, it's just don't react. Don't
react. And it's about having a huge amount of strategic self-awareness. And I think that's the thing for leaders particularly, and even within teams. Having strategic self-awareness is like really understanding your values, your core values, understanding your behaviors, and understanding that generally when we react, it's because our values have not been met, or a value has been conflicted in some way. And that's going to be your biggest, so the strongest reaction you have to something is clearly an indication of it. It's a really strong value that you hold. So for me, for example, if somebody's not kind to me or doesn't listen to what I have to say, I'm so triggered by that. I am so triggered by that. I have to work really hard to get myself under control, to manage my behavior in those moments. And I have to think about, why am I triggered by that? I'm like, okay, I understand I'm triggered by that. So what can I do now? And again, just taking that pause, taking that beat, just thinking about it, allowing myself to process it, stops me from reacting in a way that I don't want to react, because then that triggers me in the next phase of my behavior, which is then I think about guilt, and then I think, so you just end up making it more difficult by just not taking that beat and taking the heat out of the situation.
Yeah, And as you say, it's kind of, and it works. I mean, this works for all of our relationships, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In our families, or with where we were talking about our teenagers earlier, but I think in a work situation, I like the word strategic.
Yeah.
And the idea of, where do you want to get with it? So I could blow up right now about blah, 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 but it's not going to get me anywhere. So strategically, where do I want to end up?
Exactly. And it's about influence. You're thinking about, in some of those moments, it's about what influence do I want to have in this moment. And I think as soon as we lose that focus and we stop calling upon our behavioral strength, we lose our ability to have influence in the way that we want to have influence. So that's why strategic self-awareness is really key. So if you know what triggers you going into the meeting, have strategies in place. So if you are triggered, what are you going to do in those moments, and recognize what they are? It might be that you have other people in the room that know that you've been triggered and you ask them to help you. So I really find it difficult when someone does X, Y, and Z. So please, can you help me when this happens by doing X, Y, and Z? Or you speak to the person who you're going to meeting with. If you've had previous experiences with them in those moments, have that conversation beforehand. So it's about, how do you prepare? How do you strategize to enable yourself to be your best self in the moments you need to be your best self?
Yeah, this is fantastic. I mean, it feels like, we should all have this information. You know what I mean? And often many of us become leaders without really any training. We just sort of, we're good at something, and then, I'm good at creativity and writing, and then all of a sudden I became an editor, and it's almost like on the job about how to lead it.
That's true.
I think to you.
Yeah, I think what happens in a lot of organizations is that we are promoted because we're good at our existing role. And I think sometimes there aren't many checks and measures about whether you're going to make a good leader. So being a really good technical expert does not necessarily make you a really good leader. And I think organizations need to really think carefully about that when they promote people. You need someone that's a good all-rounder, really, to be a leader. It's like the person you have at the school team, that they play a bit of every sport. They're never going to be the captain or the best, but they're capable of doing everything. So it's about kind of leveraging those strengths, and it's about having that growth mindset as well. Not everybody can be exceptional at every single kind of capability that's needed to be a leader. But what you do need to know is the ability to show a behavioral flexibility. So if you can flex those skills and you are open and you're willing to have a growth mindset, then they're the people that make really good leaders. And I'm not talking about charismatic leaders or narcissistic leaders. I'm talking about humble leadership. Humility in leadership is absolutely the new way to run your teams, to look at organizations. And we see narcissistic leadership, we see it all the time. We see it a lot in the States. We see it a lot in this country. But there's a better way to do it that engages people, that makes them feel included, that makes them feel like they are valued. And that's the kind of leadership, and that speaks to the motivation we were talking about before. And
so humble leadership, again, I love that. I really do. So humble, which is valuing other people, listening to other people, and what you said right at the beginning of the interview, which is, on an individual basis, is really hearing people and what makes them tick, rather than not really getting to, and the virtual environment probably enables us to do that in a much more effective way. Sarah, this is dynamite. This is dynamite stuff. I'm really enjoyed chatting you personally. I've learned such a lot from you today. It's great.
I'm really pleased. I'm really pleased.
Really good. So just one thing before we one last tip for us all around, you talked about the happy productive theory. So if you're going to take one thing away from today, whether you're a leader or whether you're someone who's just started working from home, what was the best tip to be a happy productive person in the workspace?
Communication. I'd always say communication. It's about being very clear with your communication, being clear with your intentions, and just holding yourself accountable and holding others accountable. So that kind of goes back to that contracting. But if you communicate clearly with people, then I think then there can be no space for people to misunderstand, to not be able to support you, help you, give you what you need. in order for you to be happy and productive. And whether that's on a work front, on a well-being front, on a values front, on a growth front, I think there's a lot of this. I know it seems so simple, but it's all about the art of communication.
Brilliant. Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a delight.
My pleasure.
All of our details are below, so if you do need a brilliant coach in your organisation to help with this new phase that we're going through post-COVID, then Sarah may be a brilliant person to help you with that. Sarah, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Bye-bye.